Hello and welcome to the Android Fireside Chat, another edition of this thing. You will notice that there are a lot of people on stage up here. This is probably the most they have for any session ever at I/O. In fact, it's so many that we're in danger of violating the fire code. We may need to ask the audience to leave. We're going to do a seriously quick introduction of the people on stage so you get an idea of A, who they are, B, more importantly, what they actually do and what answers they may actually be able to provide. Starting with me. I'm just the MC. I don't matter. I'm Chet. Brian, go.
Brian Carlstrom, Programming Languages, Java, C++, and Kotlin.
Wale, Windows and Activities.
Rashad, Android Media.
Tornorby, Android Studio.
Romain Guy, Graphics.
Xavier Ducroix, Developer Tools.
Dan Sandler, System UI.
Rachel Garb, User Experience.
Ben Poise, Framework.
Arash Mabad, Play Store app and Android Instant
Apps. Tom Kinch, Android Test Support Library and Espresso.
Shaowen Shin, Android Security.
Tim Murray, Android Performance.
Steph Cuthbertson, Android IDEs and Frameworks.
Dave Burke, Pure Android Overhead. Yeet Boyer, Architecture Components.
I'm a guest here. I'm from JetBrains. I'm CEO of JetBrains, Maxim Shafirov.
Adam Powell, Framework. Mike Laron, Lesser Android Overhead.
Diane Happer, manage the Framework team.
All right, so everybody got that? Excellent. Moving on, we have a few slides to cover, a little bit of content before we get into the meat of it. So, oh, no, actually, let's just get into it. So here's the way it works. I'll ask a couple so you understand what this is. You're going to ask questions, and we're going to, we may evade the answers. We don't know. It depends on what you ask. The ground rule is we don't really talk about, we don't talk about futures. So if you say, yeah, but what is Google going to do, a year from now on this thing, then we will say, thank you for the question. Would somebody else like to ask one? Just so you know, when we say that, there's a reason. But I will show you how this works for a couple of things. So we trolled Twitter and G+ to get some questions, sort of pre-roll some topics, just to find out what the community would like to know about, people that weren't necessarily here. One of the things that came up, I will summarize the several comments in Twitter that essentially came down to, what about adopting Kotlin as a language for Android?
Check.
Done?
All right, here's another one that came up. A few different comments phrased in different ways, but essentially boils down to a two-part question. How does Fuchsia relate to Android? Dave?
How do you spell Fuchsia? Fuchsia is an early-stage experimental project. We actually have lots of cool early projects at Google. I think what's interesting here is it's open source, so people can see it and comment on it. Like lots of early-stage projects, it's going to probably pivot and morph. There's some really smart people on it, people we've worked with who are great. And so we're just kind of excited to see what happens. But it's definitely a different sort of independent project to Android. Yeah, that's basically it.
Thank you. So, okay, we're going to ask another question here, but we could actually multi-process this thing. People should be lining up at the mics if they want to ask questions. And if nobody wants to ask questions, it's fine by us. The session will end very early. So, second part of two-part question for Mike. How does Flutter relate to Android?
Well, let's see. We have pretty much the entire Android team. What do you all think is the best framework for Android? Is it Android?
Usually.
Yeah, so we kind of like our own stuff. But Android has always been pretty open. It's our core principle. So the better answer is use whatever works for you. We try to make stuff that works for you. We hope you like it. We hope you use it. If you do, that's great. If you find something that you like better, then that gives us something to shoot for.
All right, we have people at the mics now, so why don't we go to a mic over on the left there.
Hello. My question is, for people who are starting with Android, do you recommend them use Java or Kotlin?
Great question. I think one of the things we made clear in the keynote, and we are trying to say very clearly, is we're embracing Kotlin. Someone can hug Max there if you want. Yeah, hug Max. We're embracing Kotlin, embrace. But we're also doubling down simultaneously on our existing languages. And we're very open about that in the keynote with the investments in, for instance, Java 8 language features. Lambdas are my personal favorite in the Java C compiler. We also made extensive improvements in APIs. Again, the java.time API is my personal favorite, and there was a phalanx of improvements there. We also made extensive improvements in C++. And you'll continue to see investment in Kotlin and also investment in our existing programming languages. In fact, very specifically, Dave has increased the size of the teams in all of those areas. So it's not an either or for us, it truly is an and. So we really do believe that for developers who want to stay with the Java programming language, it is a wonderful language. I've told people when I studied CS at Brown, it was the first language that I learned, and it is wonderful. That said, for those who would like to try Kotlin, it is quite a beautiful language, and a lot of us here have tried it and think it's quite wonderful.
So if I could rephrase, that was either one should work. Did I catch the essence of that? You could try either one. Yeah. OK. I'm sorry. You want to find some more words for that? We could go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead.
It's a good thing they cut me off in the keynote, huh?
All right. I think we got it. Thank you. Let's go over there. You could turn it on your friends' devices. Otherwise,
so to be perfectly honest, like we're not on those teams, so that's why we're kind of looking at each other. We do really think that privacy is a control that you should have, and you still have that in all these services. If you're asking for those teams to support the new services they're introducing and then not require location history and other things, part of what makes those features good is to use those services. If they're having a chat of their own like this, I would ask you to ask them. But we are ensuring that you always have the choice. It may not be the choice that you necessarily want of fine-grained choices within, but we do think you should have the visibility to know what's on and have a control in the OS to turn it on or turn it off.
Thanks. You, sir.
Yeah. So I actually did have Project Travel as part of my keynote, but we didn't have enough time. Number one. Number two is it's a very device manufacturer-focused project, and so we thought we might bore you all a little bit. But since you've asked, I can bore you now. Bring up the teleprompter. No, I'm joking. So Project Travel, actually, if you ask a lot of people around here who worked on it, they'll tell you it was a huge amount of work, and they're still angry at me. Rashad is nodding his head. He's like so pissed off because the amount of work that went into Media Framework was huge. But basically what we did was we created a foundation layer to Android, a very formal, we call vendor interface. And it's analogous to the developer API. So today we have a developer API, and we have CTS tests that test it. The idea being you write an application that runs on any hardware. We've introduced a new vendor interface at the bottom. Everything south of the vendor interface is silicon-specific and hardware-specific. And then we have VTS tests that test that vendor interface. So the idea is when the P release comes along, if you're a device maker, you take P, and it will run on top of your vendor implementation from today's O device that you build, say. And the whole reason for that is we want to make it easier and faster for device makers to update devices. Because if it's faster, they'll get updates out more quickly. If it costs less, they'll do more updates. So that's the whole premise of it. It's a huge, huge change. We have a very formal layer. I can talk about it more, but one of the things that it's kind of analogous to Kotlin. Like with Kotlin, like last year, somebody grabbed the mic and said, "Hey, can we have Kotlin?" And everyone put their hands up, and so we gave you Kotlin. Treble, you ask, we deliver. Not really. For Treble, it was actually the silicon vendors and the device makers who were asking us, like, how do you reduce the cost? Because today, when you build an Android device, a lot of the silicon and device-specific code is intermixed with the framework and the core OS. And then every time we change the operating system, they have to rework that code. And so, they asked us, how can we make it better? And so we came up with Treble. But yeah, it's a huge change. Probably the biggest re-architecture of Android since it started. It was an enormous amount of work. And thank you to all my colleagues who hate me for implementing it. So.
Yeah, so Dave said it was a huge amount of work. I just want to make sure you understand there's a lot of engineers at Google who are not here today. They're not here at I/O. They've been working incredibly hard. They had to go through like millions of lines of code, touch lines of code they had never seen before. One guy on my team, like, I think almost lost it working on this. So you should cheer them because it's a huge amount of work. You'll never see an API, you'll never see tools, but it's going to make Android better in the future.
If we tried to bring any more engineers up on stage, the producers would have killed us. So there was a follow-up question about Treble on Twitter. So I was going to ask that one, which was, the docs say that Treble on devices launched with O, but DP1 running with Treble on existing devices. OK, that wasn't a complete sentence, but this is Twitter. So the question is, will devices that get updated to O also get Treble?
Right. So one of the challenges of doing this huge re-architecture is that if we did it sort of blindly, we'd actually slow down adoption to O, because there'd be a lot of work to do. And so we wanted to try not to slow down the short term to speed up in the long term. So if you have an existing device, you being a device maker on N, and you want to update to O, the Treble requirements aren't applied to you. However, if you're a device maker building a new device, then you have to comply to the O architecture. So that's sort of how it works. And then what we did, just to prove it all out, was we decided to treat the 2016 Pixel as a new device for O. And so this is fully what we call Trebleized, which means that all of that vendor implementation is implemented in a separate process, and it's built like you would rebuild. We basically rebuilt the system on Pixel, and we did that because we wanted to prove it out end to end, so that devices that are coming later in the year, new devices on O, will be able to sail plainly through.
When you use your Android phone, what do you really hate? And why haven't you fixed it yet?
I have one. I really hate the colors, but I'm fixing this in O.
And I really hate notifications, some that come from nameless applications from my own company. And that gentleman over there, along with members of his team, are fixing that this time with notification channels.
I really hate the lock contention in system server. So we'll fix that for the next release. Seriously, I obsess about lock contention in the system server. It bugs me.
Anyone else have a confession?
I'll go with this group should know, but battery life. And the reason we don't break it is because all of you. We have to manage the keeping you alive, but keeping battery life alive at the same time.
All right, that'll do for a sample. How about over here?
You know, that really depends on. You know, I don't regret the stuff we did, and I think you could always make improvements. You know, if you're looking for things I would change, probably the big things is like stuff that we did that allowed applications to do too much. Like a big one for me is the settings provider access, allowing applications to change system settings. I wish we had never done that, and you know, just made sure we had clear, controlled APIs for them to do things. So those are the kind of things that they're really hard after the fact, once applications start doing things to try to get them back under control. And those are the main things I think I wish we'd, you know, places we wish we'd done better at.
Thanks.
My question is to do with the blocking of broadcast receivers declared in manifests in O, which is a nice fellow. In a session this afternoon, Dan said that user choice is the essence of Android. So why won't you let users whitelist apps from this block?
Well, I mean, the manifest thing is that's not really about users. That's about developers. And you know, there's a lot of things that we don't allow applications to do because it's better for the overall device behavior. And actually, you know, the manifest receivers is actually one of the things that, speaking of things we regret doing, I think if I had done again, like having that be so easy to make things that you can launch applications like that was clearly a big mistake that we made, and we didn't really, at the times, realize that once it's there and you have like 100 applications on your phone all listening to this broadcast, the kind of like hell that's going to break loose on the device when that happens. So I really think that's something that we need to really put brakes on and get control back over the device and switch to more controlled things like Job Scheduler.
And if I could add to that on user choice, you know, I hope we announced that we have 2 billion users. If not, I just announced it. That's a reasonable fraction of the world's population. And so we think about literally everyone when we're designing it. And there's a lot of questions that it's just really hard to put in front of users and expect them to make scalable decisions, especially when applications put something in their face that says, you know, hey, just please turn this on, it'll make this feature better. And it's not the applications are doing anything wrong, usually, as their individual choice. But if 100 applications all ask for the same thing, and the user says, well, I said yes to the first 70, I'll say yes to the next 30, then they end up with an unusable device. So we have to balance user choice, which you're right, that is one of our core principles. But we have to balance that with making devices that like literally anyone can administer and manage and still have a good experience.
I can add more to that too, because on top of that, there is user choice. You can like say, I want to, if you really want to, listening to things going on, do a foreground service, and the user knows that you're running all the time now. And I think that part of this is actually having the user choice being like clear to the user. You know, it's like it's clear to the users like, oh, this application is like just running all the time because I really care about it, so it's okay with me, and I will let it to do that. Versus like subtleties about like, well, okay, I have this choice to allow it to run sometimes in the background, but I don't really know what that does, and I don't realize that when I do this a lot with a lot of applications that actually there's a lot of stuff going on in the background I'm not aware of. So I think it's, you know, we learned that like with foreground services that having that UI and having like these kind of clear lock things you go into, like, oh, I've decided to do this, so this has a lot of implications of what you do, that the user understands all that stuff together, as that's a good, you know, they can make that choice between those things. But having kind of subtle choices about like this or that, and it's not really clear what it means, really doesn't leave the user with much choice because they don't really understand.
I think that finally, that kind of shows another principle that's coming to the forefront in more recent versions of Android, which is that when the user makes a choice, we want to make sure that choice to allow the app to do something. We want to make sure that that's something that the user can actually see the effects of and make sure that they can kind of audit that behavior as they use the device. So I think that, as Diane said, the foreground service notification really does kind of provide that visibility when an app is running in the background.
Thank you.
Thanks. A little different topic, so we'll take one from online for Rachel, I believe. Is material design done, or do you see it growing and evolving?
The work is never done with design, and I think that you probably have a lot of other things, other patterns that you would like to see and have supported for your apps. So the Material team, they're growing and they're investing heavily in this space. This was an offshoot of Android. The Material team started out very small in Android, and then it grew so big that it is a completely different department. So yeah, I don't think they're sitting around twiddling their thumbs. They're definitely doing a lot to evolve the language.
Designers design.
And in particular, they just launched a bunch of code. One of the great things about having a separate department for Material is that they have now the capacity to bring on more prototypers, more software engineers. So if you go to material.io, you'll see that they've got a bunch of new components available for various different platforms to make it easier to integrate the stuff that has evolved in Material over the last couple of years. So I think you can look at their work product along a number of different axes and see that Material design is alive and well and continuing to evolve.
And to see all that stuff, you go to material.io. Lots of good stuff there, resources, tools, good articles.
Thanks. How about there?
Hey, everyone. Like everyone else, I'm really excited to hear this first-party support and encouragement for application development in Kotlin. I'm wondering if that same support and encouragement will extend to Gradle's script Kotlin when it's released probably later in the year.
You mean to build, to write build files?
Yeah, to build files.
Yeah, we do plan to support it as soon as it's finished on the Gradle side.
Thanks. But here.
Yeah, so this is a question of Kotlin. For third-party frameworks, are you going to need to add anything like a bridging header as you do in Swift to Objective-C to support Java projects and Kotlin project? And other way around, are we going to need to add any sort of bridging in an Android project to use a Java framework or Java third-party framework?
No, I don't think so. Right? Max?
So Kotlin has some kind of a standard library, which is about 600 kilobytes. So that's the only thing you need to add.
Thanks.
So Tim showed us yesterday a new systrace profile apps, and then Tor showed us today the CPU monitor. I'd like to know how those compare and contrast. What are the value of each?
Cage fight.
So systrace gets all of its data from the Linux kernel. It doesn't really do anything with your application directly. It's not going to go and see what functions take a long time or anything like that. It's just going to say, hey, your app was running here, and then it stopped running here. That's all it knows. The CPU profiler in Android Studio, on the other hand, will actually sample the runtime of your application and tell you, hey, you're spending 50 milliseconds in this function and 4 milliseconds in this function and things like that. That means that the CPU profiler has higher overhead, which means it can perturb the results of your performance testing, but it gives you greater visibility into your application. So my general recommendation would be use systrace to get a general idea of how your application runs, because you will probably spot a lot of problems there. Once you have some idea of what's taking too long, you can use the CPU profiler to get a closer look inside your application.
Great, thanks.
Tor, did that cover it?
That sounds good.
No rebuttal?
Yeah, I mean, the CPU profiler has a low overhead mode until you start recording actual sampling. So you can use it initially as well, but systrace obviously does more whole system tracing.
Right, thanks.
Hello. I believe we have not heard much about data binding this week, and I wonder if that's still a technology we should be continued to adopt.
Yeet.
Yes, actually, so with the architecture components, we shipped a sample application that uses data binding. So we're still working on that. Tools are still working on that, right, Tor?
Yes. No, we should. We have a lot of other things we're working on too, but data binding is one of our responsibilities.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yes.
Hi. I started writing Kotlin last week, and I felt that it felt oddly familiar. And I thought that's because I spent the last year doing code reviews of our iOS developer in Swift. So I was wondering if you could comment on the relationship between Kotlin and Swift.
We are independent. There is a lot of resemblance, I guess, because we are aiming for the same task to make it productive developers.
Yeah, I meant conceptually. Thank you.
Max is quite modest. He actually was one of the key folks who contributed to the language. Andrei Breslov is probably here now. It's also very, very significant, and he's the lead language designer. I talk too much, don't I? The one fact that Dave and I were just talking about is Kotlin does predate Swift. In fact, the first announcement about Kotlin was in 2011, and the first release was in 2012. The language has evolved since then. So it's just an interesting fact. It's good to know.
Thanks.
Hello. So I personally think that being open and open source is one of the most important powers of Android, and one of the most important announcements for me this week was that the Firebase SDKs are being open sourced, and unfortunately Android SDK is not currently, but will follow. So the question is, what about Google Play services? Is there a plan to, because Firebase Android SDK and the Play services are so integrated, so Firebase can be open source now, but why not Play services?
I think, so the thing about Play services is it's, there's lots of stuff in there. Some of it is developer focused, and some of it is just really extension of applications, like Google's own applications. And so the sort of Google policy with their applications is they're just not open sourced. The challenge is there's no easy way in GMS core to sort of say, hey, this is a developer component, and this is an extension of an app component. So yeah. Also, we don't have anyone from the GMS core or the Play services team here, so I can punt the question.
We punt the questions to you, so if you're going to punt the question, I don't know what to do with it.
I'll go into an infinite loop.
Moving on?
Moving on.
All right. Let me go to a theoretical thing. What's the one piece of advice you would like developers to never, ever follow when making Android apps? Anybody?
Force garbage collection? I don't know.
Thread.sleep in the onDraw method? No? OK.
Use an application context for everything.
OK. Moving on. You.
Hi. So we saw the introduction at I/O of a bunch of really great new performance profiling tools, for example, for network and for CPU. One thing that's still kind of missing is a good battery profiler for our applications. We do have battery stats and battery historian, but they're extremely difficult to use and to interpret the results from. And I was wondering if battery profiling for our apps is something that we might be able to look forward to.
I think, yeah. So if it's a very good question, and one of the things we talked about was that the battery profiling really has to be based on CPU network. We want to look at those two things as really important inputs. And so we felt like it was important to do CPU and network first. So those were our initial profilers. We don't talk about futures, but I will say that we get a lot of questions about battery profiling. So you can read that however you want.
That's code for Steph and team are working on it.
So, Arash, do you know about the Play dashboard stuff that was going on? Wasn't battery one of the stats that we're talking about there?
Yeah, so we're going to start showing system health information within the Play console. The team has been hard at work at this, and it's going to include everything from crashes to memory usage to, is that right, Ben? Battery?
So what we put out there was stuck wake locks, which is a big battery drain in the system, the number of wake ups that are happening in your application, and then also information about janky frames. So if your application is running and it's really high CPU intensive, you'll get information about that fix those issues, both the very short jank events and the really severe, horrible jank events that we named after our vice president behind us that we call internally a Davy. And I'm glad I found an opportunity to talk about it. So thank you so much for that question. You're famous.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Steven from XDA Developers, and I have a follow-up question about Treble. So we're very excited about Treble, the whole how it's going to help make it easier to upgrade to new versions. But the most exciting part for us is the mention of more work on open sourcing hardware drivers. Is the work going to be, that Google's going to be doing mostly focused on the existing projects like Fridrino and Lima, or are you going to be working more to start new projects with the existing vendors and get their code open sourced?
We've been just focused on the architecture. I mean, that's really up to the silicon vendors and the device makers. So we just wanted to make sure we had a much nicer architecture. We haven't really put thought into that specific aspect of it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Hey, everyone. So last year at I/O, there was a really excellent session on attention and notifications and treating people well. I was wondering, so since we saw that manifest this year through notification channels and through attention-based notification sorting, are there any other issues like that on the platform that you are near and dear to your heart that you wish developers kind of spent more time thinking about?
Why applications need permissions. We get that a lot internally about they understand the premise, but not necessarily what the entire application is doing with that data. And so that's something that I would love to see developers take a lot of care about asking in context. And we found when it's in context, users understand better why they're giving you something. They're more inclined to give it to you if the answer or if the context is good and they understand the value. So always put a lot of time into that because users appreciate it.
And I'd broaden that even more to settings in general. We know from foundational research that users get pretty overwhelmed by the number of settings and being able to find what they need at the moment that they need it. So, apps should really think about every single setting that they want to introduce. And is it really necessary? Can a smart choice be made that will satisfy a majority of the users? We think about that too on the platform level, and we have to keep thinking about that. It gets more complicated over time.
And every new feature, every new setting, every new thing we add to Android stands atop 10 things we didn't add. It's a huge part of how we design things and how we want to encourage apps to do things. And honestly, every year we add new stuff. We've probably already just launched the stuff that users are going to find terrible and then we're going to come back and fix next year. So we keep ourselves in business.
I'll add on. So I think APK size is another one. A lot of our users, given their global footprint, have lower-end devices, and I think those might not always be the users that monetize the best, but they also can't afford to upgrade. So I think it's really important as a developer community that we kind of band together and really improve our apps on those low-end devices, both from an APK size standpoint and from a RAM usage standpoint.
I'm going to put words in Tim's mouth and say that he wants everyone to care more about performance as well. So some of the stuff, some of the sessions here, as well as some of the tools that we're talking about are coming out because we want it to be easier for developers to actually chase that information so that they can fix it for users. Am I allowed to provide an answer? Would somebody else like to say that instead? Is that good? All right. OK. You.
Hi. I get the sense that you guys really like Kotlin a lot. And I'm wondering if you have any future plans to implement platform framework components using Kotlin? And if so, would you expose SDK APIs?
Well, as has been said, we are also committed to Java, and just pragmatically, the bazillion lines of code that we already have is Java. So I think as much as we love it, the reality is we're probably going to be continuing to produce Java code for the near future. At the point where we're starting to introduce new features in Kotlin, it's going to be something that we make sure is 100% compatible with Java programming language too. So it's going to be something that's going to take us a while to adopt internally. The first thing that we'll probably see from us is that we'll make sure that our Java programming language APIs, the legacy ones that we already have and the new ones that we create interoperate perfectly with Kotlin. So that's going to be a goal from us starting from now, going forward.
I should clarify that bazillion lines of code was just an estimate. It's actually far more.
Technically 1.036 bazillion.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yes.
Hi. Yesterday I went to a talk about progressive web apps, and these guys are really catching up. So should I invest my time learning JavaScript or Kotlin?
So Kotlin has a JavaScript backend. You can write Kotlin that compares to JavaScript, so you can do both.
I'm happy to take a stab at it. So I think the way to think about PWAs, progressive web apps, is really if your company is already focused on building a flagship product on mobile web, I think it's unrealistic for you to go and say, well, let's pivot that entire team to go and focus on app development. Obviously, everyone on the stage here is an Android diehard, and we're really focused on improving both the SDK and the operating system. And what we want to do is say, if you're really focused on building a native app experience, and you believe that's where it converts best for your users, then we want to make it as easy as possible for you to get those users onto your app experience, both from a developer standpoint and from a reachability standpoint.
Great. Thanks.
What are some great new things you think have been overlooked or were left out of I/O this year for some reason?
So what are things that we decided to not talk about that we would talk about now?
Yeah, or things that, well, I mean.
I mean, the biggest one is Project Treble. Like, that is, like, enormous. What else? Did we talk about downloadable fonts and emoji? That's kind of cool.
Yep.
Talk about that?
Yep. We can talk about it again, but yeah, we did.
Did we talk about the garbage collector? That it went down from
tomorrow.
2.
There's a session on garbage collector.
Well, am I going to steal a thunder if I mention it? How cool it is and how fast it is. Did you know that we used to only garbage collect when processes were in the background, but now that it's so fast, we garbage collect in the foreground? It's super cool. But I'm stealing Brian's thunder, so I'll stop now. And also Dex code layout. Did we talk about that? Is that your thunder? It's being stolen? OK. So I'll stop stealing his thunder. You should go to the art talk tomorrow. It's cool stuff.
I have a hard time believing you guys fit everything into all your presentations.
Yes.
So our app is localized in about 50 languages, and we also have a lot of resources that are localized as well. Is there any thought around being able to conditionally download those resources as opposed to addressing them all in one massive resource definition? For the purposes of a smaller app, basically.
Yeah, Google definitely has that problem with their apps, and it's something we're aware of. I'm not going to talk about future stuff. There's split APKs that we introduced in the platform in L that's not being used yet, and we are kind of setting up to address that problem, but nothing right now.
Sure, thanks.
I have an answer for the previous question. It's something my team did. I should have thought about it. Updatable graphics drivers. We now in O have the ability to update the graphics drivers from the Play Store.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question.
Oh, OK. Is Volley still the recommended networking solution?
Ficus is not here. Can we say no?
So in the architecture components, we recommend using retrofit. We already use OKHTTP. That's what we say. Oh, so also, if we are doing image loading, we think Glide is a very nice library. But these are recommendations. That's it. Go.
Thanks. We did have one more important question online, and then we'll close it down. It was, my app crashes with null pointer exception when the user rotates the phone while a network request is happening. Do you have any plans to fix?
Yes.
Thank you.